Je suis vraiment ravi, et c'est un euphémisme, de vous accueillir ce soir en si grand nombre pour cette conférence commémorative Ian Kerr. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barito. I am the director of the Center for Law, Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa. I'm also the University Research Chair in Technology and Society and an associate professor in the Faculty of Law, Common Law section. Welcome to the inaugural Ian Kerr Memorial Lecture, the opening public lecture of a series of events over 3 days celebrating the legacy of our missed friend and colleague, Ian Kerr. To start, I will give the floor to Dr. Sylvain Charbonneau, the Vice President Research and Innovation of the university, who will deliver the Indigenous Affirmation and some welcome remarks.
Merci bien, Florian. Alors, bonsoir tout le monde, mesdames et messieurs. Comme on l'a introduit, mon nom est Sylvain Charbonneau et je suis vice-recteur à la recherche et à l'innovation ici même à l'Université d'Ottawa. Il me fait plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue sur notre campus, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this Ian R. Kerr Memorial Lecture. Lorsque nous nous réunissons pour un événement comme celui-ci, nous avons coutume de rendre une affirmation autochtone en appui aux efforts de réconciliation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which to this day remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all across the nations in Canada who calls Ottawa home. Nous reconnaissons les gardiennes et gardiens des savoirs traditionnels de tout âge. This memorial lecture series is very special for many of us. What a great way to commemorate our late colleague, Ian Kerr, by welcoming distinguished thinkers from around the world to share innovative ideas and present to a large public new discovery on important subjects of interest on current and future technological issues. All those who had the great pleasure to work with Ian know what a remarkable legacy he leaves behind. Founding members of our Center for Law, Technology and Society, Professor Kerr joined the Faculty of Law, Common Law section in 2000 and was named the following year the Canada Research Chair in Ethics, Law and Technology. Souvenez-vous, c'est alors le début d'un nouveau millénaire. La planète tout entière a retenu son souffle dans la nuit du 31 décembre 1999, en raison, naturellement, du blog informatique qui, comme vous le savez, ne s'est jamais produit. On pouvait maintenant se retourner vers l'avenir. C'était les années 2000, après tout. L'intelligence artificielle qui était déjà présente dans certains secteurs de la société prenait toute nouvelle tangente. Great visionary, Ian quickly identified the need to examine the legal and ethical implication of technology years before these issues emerge as leading societal concern as they are today. La conférence de ce soir est organisée par le Centre de recherche en droit, technologie et société en collaboration avec l'initiative IA et Société, une initiative interfacultaire et interdisciplinaire unique qui fait la force de notre université, ici même à l'Université d'Ottawa. The Center for Law, Technology and Society is Canada's premier research group on technology, law, ethics, and policy, and a global leader advancing research and policy in an interdisciplinary setting for the benefit of Canadians and the world. It brings together 23 faculty members from 4 faculties: engineering, law, both civil and common law sections, arts, and social sciences. More than 100 fellows, researchers, and students are involved in these activities. Over the last 20 years, this group has been leading global conversations on the impact of technology on society and civil liberties in efforts to shape policy for the better future in the digital context. It has been recognized as one of the top 15 global research hubs with collaboration across the Americas, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Oceania. The international conference Shaping AI for Just Futures, which will take place over the next 2 days, is a great example of such collaborations. For today's inaugural lecture, we have the great honor and pleasure to welcoming a very special guest, Kate Crawford. For those of you who don't know Professor Crawford, suffice to say that she is a writer, a composer, and a producer. And if this was not enough, she's also a world-renowned researcher in artificial intelligence who studies the social and political implications of AI. And it is in this capacity that Kate has accepted to speak tonight. Her latest book, Atlas for AI, published in 2021, won the Sally Hacker Prize for the Society for the History of Technology. She was also recently named on the Times 100 AI list. I'm delighted to welcome such a distinguished scholars on our campus, a testament of the leadership of our universities in the field of technology, law, policy, and ethics. Je cède maintenant la parole au professeur Martin Berito, chef d'orchestre pour ces 3 jours d'événements majeurs pour notre université, qui va nous parler brièvement du fonds Ian R. Kerr, ainsi que présenter notre conférencière invitée. Merci et je vous souhaite une excellente conférence.
Thank you so much, Sylvain. So tonight we're celebrating Dr. Ian R. Kerr, who was the Canada Research Chair in Ethics, Law and Technology at the University of Ottawa. Ian was a mentor, a colleague, a teacher, a friend, and just a great human being. Ian passed away, as you all know, in 2019, and we never really had the opportunity to celebrate his research legacy in person as the pandemic hit. We were supposed to do so at We Robot 2020, but Ian was so excited to finally host back home in Canada, which was supposed to be hosted at Ottawa in April 2020, and for obvious reason, this event was canceled and happened virtually. So tonight and this week, this is our moment. It's a global research community coming together to remember, celebrate, and steward his amazing legacy. As Vice President Charbonneau was mentioning, Ian joined the faculty in 2000, was quickly named a Canada Research Chair, and Ian quickly identified the need to examine the legal and ethical implication of technology years before these issues emerge as leading societal concerns. His career spanned a myriad of law and policy challenges, included robots and the law way before it was cool, AI way before it was all over the news, privacy way before it was all over the news, surveillance, security, digital rights management, everything way before everybody started to do it because it was cool in the news. And as always, he brought a unique multidisciplinary perspective. It had actually a 4-way appointment. His main appointment was in the common law section in the law school, but he was also cross-appointed in medicine, philosophy, and information studies. Ian was an amazing teacher, a world-class researcher, a devoted colleague and generous friend and mentor. He was widely recognized as such talent whose impact on student, faculty, and this field will be felt for decades to come. At the University of Ottawa, he was an exceptional builder, playing the lead role in creating the LLM in law and technology and co-founding with our colleague Michael Geist what became a research group that became the University of Ottawa Center for Law, Technology, and Society. Ian's generosity, warmth, and good humor touched the lives of thousands of people, whether national privacy commissioners or first-year law students. He made time for everyone, offering encouragement, insight, and a deeply held view that everyone had an opportunity and responsibility to help shape our collective digital future. Ian took care of junior scholars, pushing them to change the status quo, supporting and welcoming diverse voices in the law and tech academia, notably women, queer voices, to build an amazing community. And I have so many amazing stories, even personally, but the first time I met Ian in person was for my panel interview on campus for the job I host today. And just the way he talked to me, being like, yeah, you have some amazing, like, cool side project. What are they, like, your side project? This is what people are going to talk about in like 5, 10 years. You should focus on this. And don't just listen to other people telling you, you should focus on the more traditional research to fit the expectation of like academia, of the job market, like create your own like research area. I tried to listen to himself, as he empowered a very impressed and shy PhD candidate, and I kept this conversation in mind ever since for all of my ideas and projects that some might sometime consider crazy, but I've been told I should not say so tonight. And to honor his amazing memory, we have established the Jan Erker Memorial Fund. Sorry for this. The Memorial Fund, which will continue his remarkable legacy by supporting students, innovating programming, and cutting-edge research in the fields of technology, law, ethics, and policy. Please consider giving today and tomorrow. You have all little flyers on the tables with QR codes to the donation page, either in French or in English. You have also the QR codes on the screen, and all is on our website. Jan's vision was to ensure that top students from around the world would have the necessary funding and support to pursue their scholarly dreams, researching the legal, ethical, and policy questions surrounding new technologies at the University of Ottawa. To continue his efforts toward a more inclusive academy and empowering emerging researchers, the fund supports the new Kerr Fellowships to provide graduate scholarship for students from non-traditional backgrounds or perspective or from abroad who are not usually supported by traditional funding scheme to notably pursue the LLM in law and technology at the university. And tonight I'm very happy to welcome to the University of Ottawa, to the law school and to the center, the first Kerr Fellow who joined our LLM program in law and technology a few weeks ago, Jinika Ezeoke, who is a lawyer from Nigeria who research focus on AI and policy. I think she's in the back of the room, but I would like to applaud her. And I would invite you to go recognize her and to chat with her during the reception. We're delighted to have you with us tonight and this year at the University of Ottawa. And the Kerr Lecture will also support other initiatives that will continue his legacy of excellence in research, the boundaries of thought leadership on technology and society. And this includes the new Kerr Lectures, a new high-level event series that enable distinguished thinkers from around the world to share with the general public the result of original studies on important subjects regarding technological issues. And before starting the lecture, we just decided to add a little special moment tonight. As many of you may know, Ian loved Eric Joyner's Portraits of Robots and the Donuts. They illustrated his website, the collection on robots law that he co-edited with Michael Fromkin and Ryan Kello, and the Re-Robot 2020 edition. And in 2019 and 2020, we asked Eric Joyner to bring Jan's memory to Canvas. Jan was an explorer, a pioneer, a trailblazer, a dreamer, a mentor, a friend who further unlocked our universes. He dreamed, he learned to stare by the stars, and taught us with music, donuts, pizza, and robots. And we did an unveiling during the pandemic, on Teams. But tonight I'm delighted to show you the actual painting to present to you Endless Knowledge, an original piece by Eric Joyner that was commissioned by Jan's family and his friends at the University of Ottawa to celebrate the musician, the friend to dogs, the finisher of donuts, and the philosopher of robots. And on this, welcome to the inaugural...
So great. It was really fun.
Welcome to the inaugural Jan Erker Memorial Lecture. This is a very special lecture with a very distinguished speaker tonight. But, beyond the traditional academic lecture, we wanted to make sure to celebrate and remember the incredible legacy of Jan. In a time where people and leaders are starting to finally acknowledge issues regarding AI, I would like to note that Jan was already writing about this 30 years ago. Our world and our policies would be quite different today if people had listened to him. And to reflect on the politics of AI and on Jan's legacy, we are delighted to have our inaugural Kerr lecturer, a dear friend of Jan, one of the 100 most influential people in AI according to Time magazine, Professor Kate Crawford. And Professor Crawford is a leading initial scholar of the social implication of AI. She's a research professor at USC Annenberg, a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research, an honorary professor of the University of Sydney, and was the inaugural visiting chair for AI and Justice at École Normale Supérieure in Paris. And we discussed with Kate a few weeks ago in New York, and we agreed that we need Jan more than ever today when we look at the landscape of what's happening with AI around the world. And so for the inaugural Kerr lecture, we thought it would be appropriate to bring Prof. Crawford's scholarship, The State of AI Politics in the World, in connections to Jan's research to celebrate his legacy. And to do so, I thought of involving tonight Jan, one of Jan's most brilliant former students, that when I joined U Ottawa, it was like, I want to bring someone back to Ottawa. You're going to meet her, and you're going to become best friend. You're going to love her. We actually met, and we become best friend, and we traveled the world. He was fully right. And so to do that connection, I'm delighted to present my dear friend and Jan's mentee, Dr. Katie Sislagi, who is now an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba. An engineer and a lawyer, she connects her backgrounds to lead an innovative research agenda analyzing the legal theory and intersection with AI, tracing impacts of predictive analytics and automation. And tonight, she will facilitate a conversation with Kate Crawford. And so, Kate, the floor is yours.
So good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. Of course, this was all meant to happen in 2020, and it is a delight that we actually are here in person together to honor Ian's memory. So I'm going to start off by just saying a few words about what made Ian so special to me. He was a truly rare individual and a dear friend, and I miss him deeply. He was that extraordinary combination of a person who can model kindness, generosity, warmth, and creativity in everything he did. To me, he was also a model of what an academic can be. He was, of course, very far-sighted, we've heard. He was brilliant. He was rigorous. He was interdisciplinary by nature. But he was also extraordinary. He was such an extraordinary mentor and a supporter of people and recognizing people's deep worth. And I hate to say it, that's rarer in academia than it should be. And he really showed why that is so transformative to building communities. So over decades, of course, we know he was leading discussions in AI, robotics, ethics, and law. But that's because he saw the seriousness of these issues and what could happen if companies were allowed to dominate these powerful technologies in order to centralize power. And unfortunately, that has become a signature of our time. And he saw this with laser clarity. So we're going to be talking about that together tonight. But beyond all of these professional accomplishments, I loved that he was a rebel and a truly unconventional thinker. And I'm going to start because we're all sharing our favorite stories about Ian. So Ian and I met in 2013. I can't believe that's a decade ago. It's a decade ago. We met at a conference called the Privacy Law Scholars Conference in Berkeley. That was the year that the Snowden documents dropped. And so there was a special session and we all sat up late discussing the implications of the Snowden releases. And as the night wore on and the conversations started to become more personal, Ian and I bonded over the fact that we were both musicians and in bands, throughout our lives. And we were talking about the role of creativity and why, as professors, we liked to keep that side of our lives alive. Like, how do you bring that creativity into your teaching, into your research? I mean, we were chatting earlier that Ian would play songs at the beginning of a class and show movies and really embed really different ways of thinking into his pedagogy. So I think You know, one of the things that I loved from him is that I'd get these emails and the title would always be in all caps. And I got this all caps title with like 5 exclamation points that said, "I thought you might like this," with a very cheeky, wink. And attached was a draft of a graphic novel. So you may not know that he was working on a graphic novel, but he was. It had, of course, a robot on the cover that was acting like a sort of a marionette master. It was holding a human, and it was controlling this human on a planet. And it was called The Planet of Playthings. And it was this dramatic warning about what could happen with robots, AI, and human rights. And it was interesting because one of the central characters was a young graduate student. She was studying computer science, and she had recognized that the focus on the singularity and on existential risk was a massive distraction. It was a furphy, and it was going to draw us away from focusing on the real, actual, lived harms of AI. How prescient is this? He was working on this in 2016. And of course, this year, again, existential risk is dominating the headlines. But in addition to this, it was also hilariously funny. And it was just one of these things that I was just always so impressed by his ability to simply just do what to him was going to be the most creative approach. And I think, above all, he loved to do exactly the opposite of what a law professor should do. And I think that's something that we should all take to heart. And it was one of the wonderful things about Ian. He gave you permission to be your whole self, to essentially pursue what matters to you and to find your voice. So whenever I work in less traditional academic modes, which I do from time to time, I feel in deepest comradeship with Ian. I was actually speaking with Ryan Kalo today, and he put it this way: Ian gave me the courage to do what mattered most, even if it wasn't the thing that everyone expected. So finally, my greatest memories of Ian were always when we were in deep conversation, be it about AI, law, creativity, our kids, you name it. So to honor him, I thought it would be best to do tonight's lecture as a conversation, particularly because that's what he loved. He loved conversations. And who better than to be in conversation than his last PhD student? To have Katie here, I think, is so important. And we're going to ask you all to join us in a group discussion later. So in this small way, I hope we can remember that Ian provoked us not just to think and research as individuals, but to discuss, to develop, to be in dialogue as community, because that is how we are going to address these critical issues that our society is facing. So on that note, over to Katie.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's so surreal to be here in this room. I was saying to Kate when we sat down here that I was sitting right in the very back corner there in 2009 during my law school orientation when this, young guy in a t-shirt comes up here and starts nattering on about Kafka's The Metamorphosis. And I thought, who's this punk? I haven't read The Metamorphosis. I came from engineering. All right, well, so we're going to begin with a conversation about some of Kate's really important insights into the way that AI imbricates power, is tied up in the industries, in politics, and in so doing, I'm going to try to weave in Ian's oeuvre where we can. And there's just so many prescient things that he wrote about that we want to honor him, and we want to remember, I think, the foresight and the visionary status that he really brought to us and celebrate that today. But before we do so, maybe let's give Kate an opportunity to set the lay of the land in terms of her really exciting scholarship, and particularly her recent book, Atlas of AI, which is a wonderful contribution. It's something that I very much enjoyed reading. I cited it heavily in my dissertation. And one of the things that this book does is it maps out a full material analysis of AI. And what I particularly appreciated about her book is that it brings a human geography lens to something that is often perceived as being, highly technical or a computer science space. So maybe, Kate, you can begin by telling us about some of the journeys that you went on to build that analysis.
So one of the things that I've found, certainly as a person who's researched artificial intelligence for decades now, is that there is a tendency to understand these technologies very narrowly as abstract, immaterial algorithms in the cloud. And this is something that has actually played, I think, to a very particular type of analysis, which is to understand these systems purely on their own terms as mathematical functions that we can think about technically, but without looking at their full material imprint. So back in, 2015, I started working on a project called Anatomy of an AI System with Vlad Anjola. And we wanted to map a single AI device, the Amazon Echo. So to do that, we initially sort of mapped out the data pipelines, which I knew very well. As an academic trained in the space and as somebody in industrial research, I'd also seen how these things were built. But then we asked the question, what if we go further back? What's inside it? What are the components? Where do they come from? Where are the mines? Who's working in the mines? How much are they paid? We basically did a full material analysis from soup to nuts, from the birth of these devices in mines, through shipping, smelting, all of the transit and logistical pathways, through data, and then finally to the end of life, where these devices are disposed in places like Ghana and Pakistan, and then go on to poison waterways and the earth for years to come. And after doing this profound project, it completely changed me as a researcher. I mean, I had, my background had always been, very much doing more classic STS and legal research behind a desk in an archive, working with papers. And it was clear to me that I had to go and see how these systems were built and made in the fullest sense. So I wanted to expand from analyzing a single AI device to the entire AI industry. So to do that, I had to get on my hiking boots and go to the mines, to visit mines around the world, to go to data centers, to go to technical labs, to go to Amazon fulfillment warehouses and talk to workers, to essentially do 5 years of field work, to look at these material imprints at a global scale. And to me, this was, I think in some ways, about building a political ecology rather than just a political economy of AI, to ground it in its environmental, labor, and full data impacts. And so developing that taxonomy has, I think, been really helpful to me because certainly now, as we'll see with generative AI, every one of those 3 elements, data, labor, and natural resources, is an even greater demand to build generative AI. And we can talk about the specifics of that tonight.
Yeah. And one of the things I think this taxonomy or this ecology does for us is it really showcases the malleability of the phrase artificial intelligence. And we see, different types of people, different types of corporate interests or groups really bandying about the phrase AI to mean different things. And this is one of the things that you, I think, identify really early on in Atlas of AI, that you're struggling to pinpoint that definition because there are all these other different interests that are really deeply imbricated, right? On one hand, we have this political aspect of the intelligence of mass harvesting of data. There's an industrial concentration of that information, geopolitical military power. I love this one, the deracinated environment to ongoing forms of discrimination. And so when we see AI now being used, as a phrase by marketers to really bring awareness to a new tech, hey, this thing is powered by AI. That means it's new. That means it's great. That means we should all pay attention to it, right? What are the consequences of the slipperiness of this term?
Well, it is a really slippery term, and I love this concept from the cultural theorist Zoe Safoulis, who describes sort of container technologies, that there's a sort of container that you can put any kind of definition into. And AI is like the ultimate container technology. It has changed form, it's transmuted over the decades. From when John McCarthy first coins the term in 1955, it meant something completely different to what it is today when you see built by AI on every single, sort of marketing Instagram post. So I think we've seen this term shift and change. And to me, what has been so important is to critically engage with each term, artificiality and intelligence, and looking at the histories of each of these terms. What does it preclude? What does it occlude? What do we not see? And at the term artificiality, I think automatically invokes this idea of artifice and sort of, again, a removal from the material, from the earthly. And that is, again, the trap to not see that these systems are intensely energy dependent. They're incredibly water hungry, and they use this extraordinary amount from the earth. The same goes for intelligence. We all know the sort of the dark histories of this term and how it's been mobilized against populations for decades and nay centuries. So what do we mean when this term is invoked? So having that skepticism, that critical inquiry around this term, I think is so important. And to always see it as contested. It's like, whose artificial intelligence? Who's calling it that? What is served by using that term, and what is hidden? So this is why I think at this point, it's definitely sticking around. I think, it'd be fun to try and pretend that we can just call it statistics at scale or something else, but we're stuck with it. So let's really use that as a sort of a critical moment for inquiry.
And I think in the book you talk about Minsky saying it's a suitcase term, right? You can just open it up and find in there whatever you want to unpack to call it a particular thing. I think that's really interesting, and I think that's also part of the reason why Ian wanted us, I think pretty early on, to connect some of our critiques and our analyses of AI to a bigger morality, right? And to a bigger sense of thinking. So in one of his pieces, which is called Prediction, Presumption, Preemption, he wants to connect to this idea from Stanley Milgram about an agentic shift, right? And he foresaw, I think, in that piece, a kind of moral strain that accompanies the shift from machines being designed to do something really specific to machines that are designed to exhibit emergent behavior. And in there, that there's sort of a removal of culpability, whether it be from the programmer or from the person who designed the machine or the user. And he writes about this, he says, with so-called autonomous machines, the possibility of generating unintended or unanticipated consequences is not a malfunction. It is a feature, not a bug, which is interesting, right? Because in that way, building something that we don't really know what the consequences are going to be becomes the raison d'etre of the technology. And that's problematic for all kinds of reasons that we map out. And all of this is really connected, I think, with machine learning systems forming their own sense of meaning, which you've written about really powerfully in Atlas of AI. My favorite part of the book is the linkages that you make to constructing truth through language. And it's a theme that I think is really important to pick up on in light of the conversations that are being had around natural language processing and large language models. And there's a part in particular, if you've not read it, where Kate invokes the work of sociologists and linguists like George Lakoff and John Robert Ross's work about the nouniness of nouns, which I really like. Maybe Kate can explain the concept of nouniness of nouns instead of me citing her work back to her.
Well, this is in the context of training data sets. So training data is, you could think about it as the alphabet from which AI models make meaning. These are gigantic collections of data, which at the moment are sort of really scraped from the internet at enormous scale. But certainly in my research of sort of thinking about how training data acts as ground truth, it's incredibly powerful stuff. And so many of the systems that we use today, you could think of ChatGPT, you could think of Stable Diffusion, are really trained on data sets that create a relationship between images and words. And particularly if you go to the early transformative, most used training data sets like ImageNet, you'll see that there is this idea that you can simply pin a single word to an image and that will describe it. That is a sufficiency for describing, any image that you like. I just dropped a microphone, but who knows? I'm sure it'll work. So essentially this idea, this sort of this almost like taking a museum label and pinning it to a butterfly and saying, this is what this image means, actually creates this extraordinary epistemic slippage. And this is something that, you know, I find absolutely mind-blowing. And Lakoff's work is so useful here because it's like some nouns, you know, are very descriptive. You can say, you know, this is a person, this is a cat, this is a chair. But then, so these are sort of the nouny nouns. And then we can sort of move into the more abstract nouns. Some nouns are judgments. Some nouns are grounded in sort of a moral reasoning. So when the artist Trevor Paglen and I began this 2-year study of ImageNet around 2016, we studied, you know, we opened up this training data set and we looked at the images and the words because this is something that no one does. To this day, it is extraordinary to me that engineers are not trained to look at the training data, open it up, study it, see what it says. What claims is it making about the world? Because training data is literally the stuff of world definition. This is where you define its criteria. As we started to look into these training data sets, we found absolute horrors. So in ImageNet, which has 14 million images, of which essentially there are around 20,000 categories. So noun categories connected to images, and 3,000 of these noun categories are related to people. Some of these terms are like gal or CEO, and you're like, okay, all right, let's have a look at that. Of course, gal is, you know, highly sexualized, lots of pornographic images of women, and CEO is like just images of white guys in suits, just thousands and thousands of images. So you're already starting to see a worldview coming out of this relationship between words and images. But as we dug deeper, you start to see some abstract nouns like the concept of debtor. What is it to be able to understand what a debtor looks like? How can you see into someone's bank account? I mean, it's completely illogical. And then, of course, the noun category becomes more and more judgmental. You have people who are labeled as kleptomaniacs, as, you know, alcoholics, as closet queens. I mean, it becomes incredibly defamatory and abusive. And this is the most famous training data for actually creating systems for object detection, which we then traced to see how often it's used. And it's honestly, it's the most cited in papers and it's the most used at production level systems. So this for me is the big question that has driven certainly a lot of my recent research is how do we get to the epistemics of the data that makes AI models interpret the world? Because in doing that, we can ask these deep questions around what we're doing when we ask AI models to represent something for us. It's a profound, as you say, abrogation of a type of responsibility. And that raises both legal and I think ethical questions.
Yeah, so when we start thinking through the epistemic consequences of the way that we're building knowledge through data sets, right? The way that we're building knowledge through those kinds of data points, we're struggling with this reality because we're trying to construct a ground truth from those data sets. And then we start to see recommendations or suggestions that, well, law is just about words, law is just about knowledge. So won't it be easier? Won't it be more efficient? Won't we be better able to increase access to justice if we allow these types of tools to power law?
Right.
So what then do we do about the construction of truth through legal processes if, you know, these tools start to become implicated in a legal space?
Exactly. And of course, this is the most, you know, significant debate that's going on right now in law firms is, do we use LLMs? Do we use, you know, any type of chat engine to assist in legal processes? And I've been fascinated with this concept of what's called ground truthing in machine learning. It's literally the practice of using training data sets to train a model. So what is ground truth? You know, how do we create it? This is literally sort of the mechanics of AI system building. So for law, you're having to ask very different questions around if your ground truth is being collected through a third-hand process by engineers who never look at it, by a model that then interprets it in ways that are black boxed in highly, you know, complex trillion-parameter neural nets, and then you're going to apply it. Where do you say ground truth vests? Where do you say accountability vests? And then what are the practices by which you create any kind of critical testing Or do you process in that long chain? And so this is an open question. And every law school right now is having to essentially answer this question. How do we use these systems? What kinds of questions do we need to ask? And personally, I think we're really not spending enough time looking at how these systems work, which is why I think an empirics of AI models is just so important. Having said that, one of the things that really worries me right now, and I've been studying training data for over a decade, we used to be able to know what an AI model was trained on. So GPT-2, I can more or less tell you. GPT-3, I've got some ideas, and GPT 3.5, we have some ideas too. But for GPT-4, nothing was published. It is completely unknown. We've gone into a total sort of dark space in terms of being able to study these systems. And this is a groundswell shift in computer science, which has always prided itself on being open, on publishing in places like Archive, where everyone can read, where we can all improve on each other's work. Suddenly you can hear all of the doors slamming shut across academia, across industry, where people are saying, we aren't going to publish what's in these models. We aren't going to share what we trained this system on. That is going to present an enormous problem for researchers, for lawyers, for anyone who's going to try and understand how these systems are making sense.
Yeah. And for our society, because if we are concerned about, constraining power in a legal context, we become much more concerned about how that power works when companies start to exhibit what feels like legal power, sort of moving into a quasi-legal space by the way in which they direct human activities. This is something that I think Ian talks about in a lot of different pieces, but one of the ones that I mentioned earlier, the prediction presumption piece, he begins with this quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, right? The path of law, prediction. Prediction is what lawyers do. We're in the business of this. And you see that particular quote being picked up on by people who wouldn't have shared Ian's vision of AI, people who actually want to come to a very different conclusion and propose that there are AI-powered solutions that would give you a very good idea of what courts might do, that would give you a very good idea of what the moral responsibility in a particular situation is. And one of the things that Ian writes in that paper, what he says, the nature of law itself, by shifting focus to the perspective of those who might be impacted by it, right? So trying to think through legal problems, not only in the way of, who's going to win, how much money are they going to get, what's the right answer, but also this relational account where you're going to be centering the lived experience of particular people. Something that we were working on in my dissertation work through narratives, right, through storytelling. When you're talking about the epistemologies, Kate, it reminds me of a quote I love from Robert Cover, right, where he talks about the surreal epistemology of due process. Right? This is something that we move through in legal processes in an effort to try to create meaning. And so what does that look like when we are really focused in on those data sets that increasingly are large language models. And so, of course, we can't really talk about AI right now without also specifically talking about generative AI, right? And we've already hinted at it a little, but generative AI, it's the buzzword. It's on everybody's lips this year. It's in every headline. It's why somebody wanted to interview me on the news recently. How exciting. And so for those of us who've been paying attention to AI for a long time, what's the big deal? Is generative AI just hype? Is it different from the discourses before? How should we be thinking about it?
Well, and before we get there, I just want to I'm recalling these conversations I would have with Ian about his ideas around prediction, and that there was this problem that we were both really concerned about of infinite deferral of responsibility, that you could just keep creating layers of the algorithm did it, so we're not really responsible, And in fact, of course, this is the big debate right now that's happening in the EU for the new forthcoming AI Act, which in theory is going to be, all wrapped up in a bow by the end of this year. But the debate is around, do you regulate the model or do you regulate the application? You know, again, because it's a question of where do you start to sort of say, this is where infinite deferral stops. And it's an incredibly deep problem, actually, both legally and technically, as to how you address that. But to talk about generative AI for a minute, I think we're at an inflection point. I think this is an incredibly profound year. I don't think this is, you know, hype in the way that it's going to completely disappear, simply because of the infrastructural commitment that we have seen, where every major tech company has built generative AI into everything they make, from search to Word to slides to, oh, and I've just, oh, there we go. Ah, I knew throwing the microphone on the ground was going to not pay off at a certain point. So if we think about what that means, you've seen these enormous battleships turn direction in a 12-month period. All of these companies are foundationally shifting what they do and what the business model is. That has enormous consequences. Even if you have, and you should have, questions about how effective or what generative AI is really doing, you are looking at an enormous industrial change that has far-reaching consequences. I also think, technically, it's a very important shift from predictive systems to systems that aren't really trying to make those predictions that Ian wrote about. They are literally generating new responses. And so, again, we have to come to this moment and ask fundamentally different questions, legally, socially, ethically. So yeah, I think this is something we have to take very seriously, and I think certainly it's the biggest technological shift in my lifetime.
I agree. And there's a lot of interesting questions, I think, for the legal field specifically, where we're thinking about how it's going to work in practice, but also how it's going to work in law schools, what attention we should be paying to it, how we should be treating it. And this is a place where I think, again, Ian can help us. Because while Ian's work was often visionary, the way he anticipated this generative AI phenomenon is pretty cool. It's particularly prescient. It's a 2004 piece. It's called Bots, Babes, and the Californication of Commerce. It's just a fabulous
Can we just
title.
say 2004?
2004.
Let's just reflect on that for
19 years ago. And so he's mapping the development of chatbots in this piece, right? So some of us might be familiar with ELIZA and the experiments of Joseph Weizenbaum, in which he sort of goes through this psychological exercise of how can a person become comfortable talking to a machine and what kind of information are they going to divulge as they go through that conversation. And so Ian does this, he maps this history in the paper, and then he goes on to do his own conversation with a chat representative for an online company that no longer exists called Nicole. Nicole is a virtual representative, and Ian engages in a back and forth with Nicole, and he's talking about that through the lens of moral thinking and also in terms of consumer protection in the context of electronic commerce. But it's so funny to read it now, because in the last year, we've had how many papers crop up on SSRN that are like, look, I talked to ChatGPT and it can pass the bar exam. Look, I talked to ChatGPT and it can go to law school. And you know, Ian was doing this 19 years ago. So slow your roll, you're not that innovative, guys. All right. And so while Ian's early observations on this phenomenon come to us from the realm of consumer protection, right? He's very much thinking about it as a contracts law prof. And he wants to think through the contract as a moral promise and as a participation between two parties who are engaged or somewhere with the balance of power. Maybe there's issues around unconscionability, there's issues around nudging or directing. But the broader implications of this kind of consumer tracking behavior and online preferencing have really generated a treasure trove of data over the last decade or so, since Web 2.0 became the biggest model, that has now really changed the way that training data sets work. And so you've already talked about this a little bit in terms of the ImageNet and the big systems that power LLMs. But I was reminded of a book review of yours that I read from the second edition of Oscar Gandy's The Panoptic Sort. And another person who I once saw talk in this room, we had him here right after I started working for Ian, probably 2009, 2010. And he gave a great talk that just is so visionary as well. And maybe you can talk a little bit more through that lens about the classification problems, about sorting data, about making sense of it. Because I think even in that early work and then in the later work that you've done since then, we see that talk about discrimination, bias really coming to the fore in a way that's just now being recognized.
And Oscar Gandy is a really good person to invoke here because he was an enormous influence on me. And again, you know, has remained one of the most extraordinarily prescient scholars. I mean, the panoptic sort really maps out so many of these issues in the 1990s. But the thing that's been really extraordinary in the field and the shift that I think is important to grasp is that the way in which scholars in the legal field and in STS and in social science have written about this concept of bias has in many ways, I think, been narrowed and I think in some ways really stripped of meaning in terms of the way that it's being used in the technical disciplines, which if there's a bias, then we can simply correct it by shifting demographics or by changing the weights of a model. This is literally not the problem. The problem cannot be understood through that type of narrow bias lens. We have to start thinking about the politics of classification because those politics are absolutely inherent the minute you make a training data set, the minute you classify objects, people, the planet. You are doing politics. It's politics all the way down. So once we realize that, it means that all of these processes, from making a training data set, training a model, deploying a model, these are political choices. So it matters who's in the room, what sorts of decisions are being made, who is going to be affected. So this is where Gandy, I think, is so useful, is to start to say, okay, what are these classificatory politics? Also, Jeff Bowker here is an incredibly important thinker that we have to nod to, and Alondra Nelson has been, I think, again, incredibly helpful in really raising these issues, not just in scholarly fora, but of course in her work at OSTP. So for us as a community, how do we continue to say these narrow fixes are not enough? We're talking about the politics of construction when it comes to AI and then implementation.
Yeah. I think another important issue if we're thinking about big data sets is also privacy, right? We can't get away from privacy. One of Ian's favorite topics, and given that you met at PLSC, probably also an appropriate one for us to do today. So we've, I think, thought through a lot of these problems about how data being aggregated in these massive quantities is going to start to reveal insights that the people who contributed that data to the data system never would have anticipated, right? So we already have sort of a watering down of the kind of consent that it's possible to give. And now with the generative AI shift or boom or hype, we have other consequences, I think, for privacy. What would you say about that?
Well, I mean, it's lovely to be having this conversation in Canada, but I have to say, as someone who's based in the US, the absolute failure at a regulatory level to create strong federal omnibus privacy law is absolutely devastating. The fact that we went through the social media period and absolutely failed to contend with that at a regulatory level has been, again, an extraordinary problem. And here we are facing right now, what's happening in AI is, of course, all of the CEOs of the largest tech companies were brought into the White House to come up with a voluntary agreement. It's like, oh, will you try to do your best? Thanks, that's wonderful. Let's handshake on it. You know, I mean, honestly, this is a parody of what we should be thinking about in terms of regulating privacy across the board, but AI in particular. So my worry is, and I'd love to hear when we move to Q&A shortly, where you're standing, but I think we've so profoundly lost on this that it continues to baffle me. The distinction with Europe right now is quite remarkable. If you look at the training data sets used to make, say, Stable Diffusion, you can go to haveibeentrained.com, see if images that you've made or images of yourself are in key training data sets, and you can opt them out. And this is, of course, courtesy of Article 4 of the text and data mining exception, which allows you to do that. We do not have that capacity right now, certainly in the US, and there's a whole lot of questions that are now being brought to the fore about consent and privacy in the training of these systems. And so again, something that we could go deeply into the weeds on, but it is an enormous failure across the board.
And not something that we're really leading in Canada either, as many in the room. Michael is smiling ruefully
I'm not going to talk right now.
as I say this, but I mean, definitely work that Ian was trying to work on and had done so many public presentations on. I'm reminded of one piece of his that I really love, which I feel is undercited, so I like to mention it when I can, called Schrodinger's Robot, and he wrote that in 2019. Yes. And it's a wonderful piece that talks about artificial cognition and how we're thinking through issues around privacy violation in the context of an artificial cognizer. And I know I'm supposed to wrap up soon, so I won't go into it further, but come get me later and I will tell you all about it. And so, of course, we have privacy law being implicated, and then we also have a lot of interesting conversations that need to be had around copyright and copyright law and policy. And so, just quickly before we move to the Q&A, if we have some thoughts about, what's the way forward? You already talked a little bit about ImageNet. There's the Flickr image set that was scraped under Creative Commons licenses. I'm following the really interesting legal case with Microsoft and OpenAI about GitHub Copilot. Yep. Just fascinating in terms of how these legal structures that are designed about fair use and about copyright policy generally seem really strained for the generative AI era. What do we do?
So this is a fun moment where I can give another shout out to the wonderful Jason Schultz at NYU. He and I have a new piece coming out very shortly in Grey Room called The Work of Art in the Era of Generative AI. And we look specifically at the way that generative AI, I think, is producing this absolute crisis in copyright law. And I'd be curious again to hear how others are seeing this. We look at sort of three kind of core components that I think are really interesting at this moment. One is this idea of, who is the author? The second is the idea-expression distinction. And finally is the idea of agency, like who has committed the copyright infringement? If you take any one of these three questions and you apply it to generative AI, we just have a string of question marks. So again, this idea of, at the very beginning, who is the author? Is the author the model? Is the author the company? And again, we all know that right now, anything produced by a generative model does not have copyright. Okay, so that's a profound admission that we're now in this experiment. I'd say that one of the biggest experiments of art after copyright in history. This distinction between idea and expression is again confused by generative AI when you have just a series of expressions producing these sorts of endless representations. And then finally, agency is this question of, who is accountable if there is an infringement? Takes us back to the Hall of Mirrors that Ian has written about, that endlessly deferred accountability. So I think copyright right now is super interesting, almost more interesting than it's been, in decades, because I think it's having an enormous collapse. It's really facing a hard limit, and that might be a really fun point to invite you in to be part of this discussion.
Yeah. One of the great pieces there's two great pieces I want to mention, and then we'll throw it open. But so Craig and Ian wrote a wonderful piece called Death of the AI Author, that it's not about generative AI, but it does anticipate some of these similar issues, right? Thinking through what are the copyright policy mechanisms going to do for us? And the other one is a 2009 piece called Digital Locks and the Automation of Virtue. One of the many times that the Canadian government tried to unsuccessfully amend the Copyright Act. And Ian had some interesting insights there through the lens, again, of that moral thinking, right? Where the example that he uses so powerfully is being at Tomorrowland at Disney World, being in a car. And so this is about digital rights management, right? But you're on the roller coaster and you feel like you're driving the car, but you're actually not able to control it. You're not able to turn the wheel. You're not able to really steer. And so that is, I think, one of the things that he was really worried about in moving towards a world that was powered by artificial intelligence. What does that do to our capacity as moral actors and our capacity to be able to tell right from wrong? And so as we wade into these muddy waters more and more, his insights and the interdisciplinarity, the transdisciplinarity with which he approached them are really important. All right, I went 5 minutes over time. I'm in big trouble from Sarah here. So we gotta go.
Questions. We have one over here, and we have mics somewhere. Yes? Do we have a microphone? Oh, microphones are up here, so you need to sort of come and stand behind that microphone to ask your question so everyone can hear you. Or if we can have one brought down, even better. But come and say hi. This is again, it's starting to feel like those long chats with Ian where we just sort of go deep into, and did you read this article? It's fantastic.
Hello. My name is John Anderson. I work for the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada. It's one of the big federal government unions. We have 72,000 members. Mostly IT people who work for the federal government, tax auditors, health professionals, etc. And we're extremely worried about what's happening with AI in the workplace. We now, and I'd like your thoughts on that. And I would say that there's a new bill going through called Bill C-27, which is the first bill to touch on AI at the federal level. And this bill, it's interesting, terrible for us because it excludes the federal government and crown corporations. It's only for the federally regulated private sector. And so it's very, very minimal as to who's going to actually be regulated by this bill. And we're, of course, as a federal union, we're very worried we're excluded. But one of the things, and I'll just, before I stop, is that the federal government is now using AI to evaluate employees. We don't know what they're doing with evaluation because they won't tell us. They're using it to hire employees. There again, we don't know what they're doing. And both of those, we would like to see transparency about what is happening on those. I'd like you to talk a bit about what's happening in the United States around the workplace and AI use, and that would be very interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And can I say that's incredibly worrying. This is something that I've studied for years. And in fact, an amazing student of mine, Ifoma Junwa, just wrote a book called The Quantified Worker, which also looks at so many of these profound questions that we're facing in terms of how people are hired, how they're assessed, what sorts of accountability measures, what sort of auditing do we have on these systems. And time again, what we have found is that there is just no real protection for workers in terms of the use of these systems or the use of their data. It's really profoundly underregulated. And by having done studies on these systems that are assessing workers, they are, in my experience, universally horrifying. It's things like trying to track your productivity by how many emails you send, as if that is a good assessment of productivity. Hiring systems that are literally looking at your micro expressions in your face as you answer questions in the interview in order to map your face to the faces of the most successful employees. I mean, this is pseudoscience in the extreme. And again, I can talk you through the histories of how these systems got built and the profoundly suspect science that is underneath them. But at the moment, I think one of the important things to do, and particularly in your role, is to really push back on these systems entirely, to say what is the evidence that these things work? What is the evidence that they don't create sort of a type of homophily where you hire people who are like the people you already have, which is literally what we've spent 30 plus years working in diversity and inclusion to change. We're actually going backwards. So at the very least, I think we have an enormous battle on our hands to really push back on these systems, but to demand that if they're ever going to be used at a federal level, that we can see how they work, what the data is, and that we can audit and assess them over time. But I'm much sort of darker on these approaches than most because I've spent a lot of time looking at them up close. And I honestly, to this day, I have not seen one that I'm like, that's a fantastic innovation. Well done. That will create a fairer, happier workplace. So I'm happy to talk with you further about the specifics here, but there are lots of groups and lots of unions who are starting to work together on this issue. And I think this has international significance and actually demands an international conversation. Who else is going to feel brave? Come up to the mic. Yes, fabulous.
Thank you so much for the great talk, Kate and Katie. My name is Blue. I'm a PhD student at Carleton University. My question is more specific about one of the things that you touched upon earlier. You said that the technology corporations are giving federal government a lot of promise on infrastructure-based functions. And this is an increasing trend that those infrastructure-based functions are increasingly merged into our everyday lives. The search functions that you mentioned, smart societies, more of the government admin functions that we used to theorize those infrastructure functions based on public interest. However, there is an increasingly blurred line between public interest and corporate interest. And I'm wondering, how can we start to spurse out those merged lines between public interest and corporate interest? And also that how can we begin to imagine an AI system that is based on public interest when our entire society is based on market-oriented logic? Thank you so much.
Wow, that is like a really easy question. I can give you a short answer on that in one sentence. It's a complete mess. And this blurring that you've pointed to is absolutely, I think, integral to the way that these systems have been built for a very long time. And what we've seen, even in just the last 3 years, has been an extraordinary reconcentration of power into even fewer hands. If you look at how many companies can do generative AI at scale, at a planetary scale, there's actually even fewer companies than we had who were doing large-scale social media. So you're seeing this contraction and contraction and contraction. And even when we have these moments of open sourcing, which we're certainly seeing now with generative AI, again, it's back-ending on the same cloud infrastructure, which is owned in the West by 3 companies, and again, in China by 2, depending how you count. So right now, this question of how do you build AI in the public interest is an absolute unknown. It hasn't been done at scale. And I think that is one of the most worrying things, that these systems are increasingly being used for government functions, for civil functions, but they are entirely privately run and owned and obviously focused around shareholder value. How do we make sure they're maximizing shareholder value and not public interest? So there's a lot of conversations right now about, should we create different types of corporate structures for tech companies? Sure, but I think we could be much more radical. I think we can look at the history of how certain technologies have actually moved into the public domain. How have we actually said, no, sorry, this is actually going to become a public infrastructure. Now, that's going to be very hard to do with some of these technologies, but not with others. And again, we can get into the sort of fine-grained specifics of where models are used, who gets to train them, and how they're deployed. And I think we could do a lot more nuanced scholarship around really separating out where commercial models can be used and where you could actually say, no, governments, if they're going to use these systems, have to roll their own. They have to start making their own systems and controlling those systems and understanding how they work at a very profound level in order to then know how they're affecting people. So I think you've got this mapped out for your PhD, and you'll definitely solve this for us, right? This is what your thesis is going to be. Fantastic. Thanks so much for the question.
Colleen.
Hi there. Thanks for the wonderful commentary. And just to build on the question that came before, and it's a bigger question around how do you get the folks who are meant to act in the public interest to act in the public interest. So you've mentioned the capture of governments by large regulators and, by large companies, and we see the same thing happening here with consultation processes too often only engaging with innovators, and innovators obviously have important perspectives and knowledge that we need to have as lawyers to dream up better and more efficient and effective and just regulations. So they clearly need to be at the table, but so often they're the only ones at the table. So we can dream up all of the stuff we want, but I think the real question for thought leaders is how do we actually change that essential conversation so that the people protecting the public interest are really taking into account the public interest?
Look, you've cut right to the heart of one of the issues that keeps me up at night, which is to what degree have we, particularly in the US, I'm going to say that there's actually some really interesting questions in different jurisdictions, but in the US, how much are we looking at a complete regulatory capture? And partly the more complex these systems become, the more you're seeing that type of expertise domination of like, well, you can't regulate this because only we really understand what's going on. And I would add in tribute to Ian, this current focus on existential risk, this idea that these AI systems could actually begin to dominate humanity, but only we can fix it. So please don't worry your pretty heads about it. We'll be handling it from here. Thank you very much. That extraordinary self-serving narrative that you're hearing, particularly from a very small cadre of tech billionaires right now, who are building these systems and saying that they have these enormous existential risks, but that regulators cannot see it and could not possibly have any kind of democratic function around it. It has to be run simply by them. I mean, how extraordinary. What a way of disempowering, not just, you know, as you say, experts in the field, but the entire public from saying that they have a say in this. That is the most dangerous thing that I'm seeing this year. And the more that we push back against this kind of, I think, extraordinary kind of pulling of focus towards existential risk, the better. Because it is really shifting the ability for this to become a democratic conversation at all. And I've never seen it shift as quickly as I have in the last 12 months. So, I mean, and this is something that I think should worry us all.
All right, so I see 4 people who are standing. Are you waiting to ask a question or are you stretching your legs?
It's
yeah?
Questions, all right.
Okay, so I think there are 4 people who want to ask questions and we have no more time. So whoever has the most burning question, is it you? And the rest of you, I will encourage you to approach Kate at the reception. I'm so sorry.
Can I suggest something even more radical? It's a bit naughty. Why don't we just do really quickly all 4, and then we'll do like a mega mix answer and then move into drinks.
Okay,
how does
but
that sound?
30 seconds.
Are people okay?
Ask your questions in 30 seconds or less.
All right, go.
Okay, let's see if I can do this.
No preamble. No preamble.
No pressure.
I get worried constantly, as a cybersecurity professional in public service, I might add, that we're going to kill computing in general if we're not careful. And this relates to your question about, your self-posed question about what counts as artificial intelligence anyway?
Yep.
What was your conclusion? I can't, as a former metaphysician of technology, conclude anything other than every computing device we've ever made and every brain is AI, right?
Right. Yeah, look, you're exactly right. And I think that loss of granularity.
Nope, we can't do it. We got to do a mega mix.
Questions. I think I went straight there. Quick, questions.
You're right.
Hi. I'm a policy analyst with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, but I did my master's of public policy, and my capstone was on emotion AI, and I built off of the work you did in your book. So many questions, but what I wanted to ask, actually, I came from an event yesterday with Mila and the Public Policy Forum on AI, and one of the conversations we were having was general purpose AI, frontier AI, what is sort of next? Is this the next big thing? My big question is, where are we in the AI hype cycle? There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of influencers, there's a lot of, and then there's the,
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That was more
Anyways.
than 30 seconds. We get it. There's hype. We hate
This
it.
is
Mika,
amazing.
go.
I'm an intellectual property law lawyer, and I work with a lot of patents, copyrights, and agreements between companies that are working on AI. And some of it shocks me where I'm like, this hasn't been regulated yet, or like, this is in regulation. Where do you see a role for IP lawyers?
Okay, very important. And our final friend. Go
Hey,
quick.
I'm Evan Light from Kerr University. I'm amazed at how LLMs have destroyed the concept of copyright pretty quickly. I'm wondering, given that copyright's been annihilated? What other laws are up next for total annihilation? And how does this affect the actual idea, the concept of the rule of law?
Right. Okay, this is going to be a haiku. Is computer science at risk? And I would say yes, but not for the reasons you mentioned, because without regulation, without any type of guardrails, there are going to be enormous disasters in our future, and it will absolutely threaten the ability of this field to be taken seriously and for something that can actually allow these systems to run without regulation. So there are some deep problems for the field. Where are we in the hype cycle? We are still on the upward part of the roller coaster, my friend. This is not by any means done yet. And I think we have a long way to go because of the amount of resources. It is absolutely mind-blowing being focused on this area right now to the detriment of so many other issues. What is the role of IP lawyers? Wow, you have a feast right now. There are like, all of the cases right now that are being brought against the AI companies are fascinating. I think a lot of them will be dismissed because initially they haven't been well scoped, but they're going to get better. So if you're an IP lawyer right now, talk to people who understand how these systems work first. That would be my first recommendation. But this is a really interesting time to be in that field. And the last question, help my memory here.
Copyright. What other laws are going to
Oh
get
my
destroyed?
God. Well, okay, dark, but go with me here. Human rights. I'm sorry to say it, but this is a very difficult week for a lot of reasons for many of us, for many reasons. And if you start to see the way that AI is being, and bizarrely even generative AI, is being built into military systems as we speak, imagine that in the field trying to decide who is a civilian and who is a combatant. Imagine the human rights implications of systems that have such shifting sands around this idea of ground truth. These systems that are being trusted well beyond their capacities.
And a great place to end.
Somewhat depressing.
With another wonderful piece you wrote called Asleep at the Switch and Technological Shenanigans. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. Let's continue the conversation outside. And can I just say, it's just so wonderful to all be here together. Thank you for coming tonight, and let's continue the conversation.
All right, Florian.
Thank you so much, Kate and Katie, for this amazing conversation. I will invite everybody in attendance to join us on the third floor of Photo for a reception, during which we can continue this amazing conversation. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and congratulations.